So you're wanting to play Pact of the Chain, but you're not sure what familiar to pick. Well, you're in luck, because behind today's secret door, Pact of the Chain familiars ranked. So behind today's secret door, Pact of the Chain familiars ranked. This is Secret Door, a channel devoted to in-depth discussion about Dungeons and Dragons, and my name is Matt Morich. Well, I have started a new Patreon. If you're interested in supporting the channel, your help would be greatly appreciated and much needed. The link will be in the pinned comment and in the description. And many thanks to Marcelo and Doug for your support. So I figured it was only appropriate for my first video about the new rules to be about Pact of the Chain familiars. The list is ranked, but before I get into the actual list itself, let me just point out a few of the criteria that shaped the way I put the list together and how I think about Pact of the Chain familiars to begin with. First of all, I view the role of a Pact of the Chain familiar primarily to be non-combative, meaning it isn't an active combatant. It can do the help action or other things, but I don't view it as a necessity to take investment of the Chain Master so that you can make the familiar an active combatant. I view the role of a Pact of the Chain familiar to be primarily what any familiar's role is. They just simply can do it much better than other familiars. Now, having said all that, I realize that a lot of folks out there view or desire their familiar to be an active combatant. And there's certainly a time and a place for that. So I have taken that consideration into the list itself, and you'll see how it shapes out that combat is a very big consideration in where the familiars rank in this list. So because I view Pact of the Chain familiars as superior spies and scouts, I value flight, I value having hands, and I have the ability to value the ability to turn invisible very, very highly. If it can do all three of those things, that's the magic combination. But if it has one or two of those things, that's still very, very valuable, and those values will show on the list. But I would be remiss to you if I didn't view those as almost the primary considerations. There's a lot of considerations here, but those are the three big ones. Defenses are also a big deal. Hit points or survivability of the familiar, also a big deal. Now, let me just point out that when I talk about survivability of a Pact of the Chain familiar, I'm not talking about their ability to survive in combat per se, because I don't really view Pact of the Chain familiars from a viewpoint of being a combatant. And in all my videos, I never have employed them in a combative form. But survivability is incredibly important because they are so effective, and you will create so many problems for your DM if you're actively and correctly using a Pact of the Chain familiar, that the DM is going to find ways to get rid of that familiar for you. So there will be area of effects, there will be traps with area of effects, etc., etc., etc. That familiar, if it's anywhere in that area of effect, is going to get hit by. And so their ability to survive that is critical. And of course, if they are going to be a combatant, or even how I use a familiar, which is primarily to do the help action, they are involved in combat to some degree, but their ability to therefore be able to take a punch and live to tell the tale is a very big consideration as well. Special abilities are also obviously very important, et cetera, et cetera. Everything about the familiar is considered in essence. So before I get to the actual list here, let me just also point out that after the bottom two, all of them are going to be very, very usable. The bottom two, I would view the owl as being an actual superior choice to the bottom two. After that, everything is going to be at least better than the owl in one form or another. But I don't want the viewer to think that I'm saying that because I have this as number 6 on the list and I have this as number 1, number 6 is unusable. That isn't the case. I think everything from 6 up to 1 is certainly usable. But you have to ask yourself why you're doing it and why you're not picking number 1 or number 2. In this particular list, I can see why, if you weren't taking the top pick, why you might take the second pick, or why you might even take the 6th pick. There could be great role-playing decisions for those picks. There could also be style of play. So the list is definitely what I think is best, but that doesn't mean that the rest are garbage, is my point. Except for 7 and 8, which are pretty close. Okay, well, let's get started. At number 8, we have the venomous snake. I'm not even going to really comment here. This was a familiar that was on the regular Find Familiar list, and for reasons I cannot understand, Jeremy Crawford thought that it was the most powerful familiar on that list, and therefore decided that it should be on the Warlock list. That makes no sense to me, but that's not the point. It's still a garbage pick. It is truly a garbage pick. The owl is better than the venomous snake. Don't take the venomous snake. You better have a really great role-playing reason to pick the venomous snake. And at number 7, we have the slod tadpole. Again, it is so uninteresting. The only thing that's kind of remotely interesting about the slod tadpole is it has a fair amount of resistances to damage. But other than that, again, role-playing considerations obviously trump everything. But from a mechanical standpoint, not a good pick. Okay, so that brings us to number 6, and here we'll get a little bit more thorough in each of these picks. Number 6, I believe at the number 6 selection, I'd like to put an asterisk by this, because it's kind of special in my eyes. Mechanically, it belongs here at 6, but there's a lot of reasons why I could see myself picking number 6, and that's the skeleton. So first off, the skeleton, of course, is a medium creature. So for that reason alone, it's different than all the other familiars. There is some hijinks that you could use a humanoid creature like that. There's also, it's the role-playing aspect of having a skeleton buddy. It's great. Now, it also has some mechanical support, too. So it has a short sword and a short bow, meaning that if you were wanting to use it as an active combatant, it would actually be reasonably good if you were using it from range, and you could give it magic items, which would be also great. And it does have hands, and that's a really big deal, but it can't fly, and it doesn't have invisibility, and it really doesn't have, defensively and survivability standpoint, not very strong. Also, its attacks are just basic damage attacks. There's nothing special about them. They don't impose any condition or anything else. But nevertheless, it is a ranged attack, which could be, that alone could be a reason to think about taking the skeleton if you're wanting it to be an active combatant. But the primary reason that I think you would want to take a skeleton would be for the role-playing aspects, and those could be truly great. So at number 5, we have the sprite. Now, the sprite has the Holy Trinity that I am looking for. It can fly, it has hands, and it can turn invisible. And it's even in the new player's handbook, it's received many more hit points than it had previously. And so that's great. So why do I have it at number 5? The primary reason is that the number 1 pick has those, and it does everything better. Now, the sprite does have a ranged attack, but that has strangely gotten much weaker than it was in the past. The only thing you can say about the bow attack now is that no saving throw is allowed, and that is something. But the way the charmed condition works, it's not all that valuable. It does have the heart sight ability, but in my opinion and in my experience, that's a really circumstantial ability. It's okay. I mean, it's nice to have it, but how good is it? Well, I guess if you find that it's going to be really great and useful in your campaign, that's something in its favor. But the main reason I have it here at number 5 is simply because the reasons that you might want to take the sprite from a mechanical standpoint, number 1 does it better and it's more survivable. So here it is at number 5. So at number 4, I have the Quasit. Now, the only reason the Quasit is here at number 4 and not at number 2, frankly, is that, as I said before, I'm taking combat into consideration here. So I think number 1 is better than the Quasit, but the Quasit is right behind it. Its biggest problem is it can turn invisible and it has hands. And when it shape changes, it can, of course, fly. But because it can't do all 3 of those at once, it's always going to be inferior to, in my opinion, to a familiar that can do all 3 of those things at once. In combat, the Quasit's attack it's okay in terms of damage. It's certainly nothing special, but it does inflict the poison condition and it doesn't require a save. So that is great. But that poison condition only lasts for a round, but still, that's great. So the Quasit is really good. It's really, really good. I would prefer number 1 over the Quasit, and it has the scare ability, and that's nice. If you were to pick the Quasit, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. The Quasit's even reasonably good in combat. Actually, all of them from here on out are reasonably good in combat. Number 2 and number 3 are exceptionally good in combat. And it should be noted that the Quasit has 25 hit points now. That's phenomenal. So it's going to be able to take a punch. It's a great familiar, super familiar. It's fantastic. If you wanted to argue that it should be number 2, that's fine. It's just the nature of this list and how I'm putting it together. It ends here, even though I would freely admit I think it's probably the number 2 pick. If it is the number 2 pick, if you took combat out of the equation. So at number 3, the Sphinx of Wonder. So the Sphinx of Wonder is the last of the new entries, and it is here primarily because of what it can do in combat. But there are 2 other things that it can do. First of all, as a standard familiar scouting kind of thing goes, it can fly. So there's that. It doesn't have hands, though, and it can't turn invisible. So it's substantially weaker as a scout than number 4 or number 1. But in combat, on a hit, it can do 12 points of damage on average. And that's substantial. It also has magic resistance, high hit points. Its other big draw, and it is a big draw, is that it has an ability different than all the other familiars. Twice a day, it can, as a reaction, add 2 to someone making a saving throw or an ability check. Initiative is an ability check. So I would probably want to save that ability for saving throws, as they're generally more crucial to not miss. But going first can sometimes define a fight. So it's a nice option to have that. It's a good ability. They can only use it twice a day. But that's still a nice little ability. It's not earth-shattering because it's only +2, but still, that can be the difference. So the fact that it can deal good damage as a combatant, that it flies, that it has that ability, and that it has reasonably good survivability and defenses, I would say it's number 3. I don't view it as actually above the Quasit. It's certainly, I think, above the Quasit in terms of being a combatant, and that's why it's here at number 3. If you were looking strictly for a combatant creature for your familiar, someone to really use Investment of the Chainmaster with, and you weren't worried about control effects, you just wanted the damage, the Sphinx of Wonder is who you would look at. And it's also like a cosmic blue cat with wings. So, from a role-play standpoint, there could be certainly a draw there, of course. Here we are at number 2. This is a long-time favorite familiar of mine, but I wasn't a big fan of it from the 2014 Player's Handbook, and that's the Pseudo-Dragon. The Pseudo-Dragon can fly. It doesn't have hands, and it cannot turn invisible. but it can fly. It actually can fly 60 feet. So it's actually the fastest of the flying familiars. It's what they've done with the sting that makes the pseudo-dragon so great. Now, I need to really stress this, that defensively, the pseudo-dragon is a sitting duck. It does have 10 hit points, which is better than it used to have, but it didn't get nearly as big of a bump in that regard as other familiars did. But the sting got a huge bump. It used to require a roll to hit, and then the opponent made a saving throw. That means that the chance of a failure on the part of the combatant really gets down to about 25% chance, because half the time you're probably missing, and then the other half the time they're probably making their saving throw. So on a quarter of the attacks, you might get a failure from the old version of the pseudo-dragon. But now it's a straight up saving throw to any one target that the pseudo-dragon can see within 5 feet of it. And if you are having it attack, you're obviously probably using investment of the Chain Master, and so it's going to be using your save DC. Now, if the opponent fails, they're poisoned, and if they fail by 5 or more, and poisoned is a great condition to be able to inflict. But if it fails by 5 or more, it falls asleep. That's just devastating. So it's not going to happen all that often that they're going to fail by 5 or more, but it's a potential, truly a knockout punch that you'll always have available to you. And the fact that the pseudo-dragon can cruise around the map at 60 feet means that it's going to be a really dangerous combatant. It is by far the best combatant of the familiars. The pseudo-dragon does have magic resistance, which is nice. It does have a natural armor class of 14, which is also nice. It's higher than most of the other familiars. But it only has those 10 hit points, and it doesn't have any other defenses. So it's one of those things that its punch is so good that I have to put it here at number 2. But if you're going to use the pseudo-dragon, you really need to consider how you're going to protect the pseudo-dragon, because you're going to need to protect it. In other respects, as it doesn't have hands, it can turn invisible. So in terms of other roles as a familiar goes, it's simply okay. It certainly doesn't compare to some of the others on the list, certainly not number 1, but its attack with the sting is so good. It has to be here because combat considerations for the list. So it's the gold standard of a Pact of the Chain familiar combatant. So I'm very happy that they made the pseudo-dragon very desirable and viable. And that brings us to number 1, which of course you should have been able to infer by now, is of course the imp. It has always been the best, and it still is the best. I should point out that it was it got a little bit closer in some respects in my evaluation, because the imp got better in certain respects and it got a little bit worse in others. It got a lot more hit points. It doesn't have quite as many as the Quasit does. It doesn't have as many as the Sphinx does, but it's got 21, which is a 110% increase over what it used to have. And it lost its defenses of resistance to non-magical slashing, bludgeoning, and piercing damage, which is a bummer, but then again, they more than doubled its hit points. So those hit points are good for anything. So it's definitely, I would say, better off than it was before, even though it did take a bit of a nerf in the extra defenses. But it's still resistant to cold, and it's immune to fire and poisoned. It still has magic resistance. And it can fly, it can turn invisible, and of course, it has hands. That's right, the imp has hands. And of course, it still has Devil Sight, which is fantastic, especially for a scout, so that's fantastic. It even got a bit of an upgrade in combat as a combatant as well. If it attacks, it does its damage, and then it had a saving throw for poison damage, but now it's just simply poison damage. Added on 2d6 of poison damage, added on no save. But just so I'm clear, I don't view the imp as being, I mean, it certainly can do its job in combat if you wanted to use it as investment of the Chainmaster. It can kind of do it all. It's good enough in combat. It's going to deal enough damage to be viable to use it in combat. And because it can turn invisible, it'll be able to generate advantage for itself if you want to use it as combatant, although it would have to toggle every other turn to fight if you wanted to do that, because it's an action for it to cast invisibility. But the big problem with having a combatant, and I mean someone that a familiar that's attacking, is that they're only going to be able to do that for a few levels before they're going to be hitting behind the curve unless they can generate advantage for themselves, which will balance things out. That's what makes the Pseudo-Dragon's Sting so crazy good, is that it's a straight-up saving throw. And so it doesn't have to deal with the curve ever. It's just simply going off your save DC if you're using investment. But as a straight-up combatant, you could certainly use the imp if that's what you wanted to do. That's not my big consideration. I want the imp to be the traditional scout. And in combat, because it's invisible, it can go up, perform the help action that will not violate its invisibility, and it will be able to move away because opportunity attacks can only happen to targets that they can see. So that's the list. I really wish that they hadn't thrown the bottom two in. They're almost useless. Why not give us two more usable options? I like the skeleton. I think that's a really fun choice. I could see myself easily picking the skeleton. I think it's a lot of fun. And the imp still being at number 1 is not that big of a deal because the Pseudo-Dragon, I think that Sting is mighty good. So it's kind of exciting because there's going to be times when I do a test drive now that I might be looking at other familiars other than just the imp. But the imp still is edging out at number 1. All right. Well, that's all I've got. If you enjoyed the video, please like, please share, please subscribe. And if you're stuck and you don't know where to go, you can always search for a secret door. Until next time, I cast bless on all of you.